There is a huge outcry in China over the death of a local doctor named Li Wenliang. He was one of the first people in the world to warn about the coronavirus, posting a message to other doctors in a WeChat group on December 30th. But Dr. Li was reprimanded by police and silenced. Then he got the disease from one of his patients and he died early Friday. He was 34 years old. The virus has now killed more than 800 people, including Dr. Li, and there are more than 37,000 cases, the vast majority in mainland China. So he's not the only person in Wuhan who's tried to get the word out. Ordinary people are becoming citizen journalists, joining a handful of reporters inside the quarantine zone covering this crisis. And like Dr. Li, they're risking their lives to get the truth out.
Well, it feels like a small town that's been deserted. When I arrived in the train station this afternoon, it was very empty. There are a few lost souls wandering around, trying to figure out if they could get out of Wuhan somehow.
That's New York Times journalist Chris Buckley talking to NPR about his first few days in Wuhan as he traveled from Beijing into the epicenter of the outbreak. It was just days before Wuhan and at least 15 other cities with more than 50 million people were put on lockdown. And now Buckley is one of them, one of very few Western journalists trying to get the story out. This drone footage of the city was captured by reporters at China File and reposted by the New York Times. You can see city streets are deserted, the airport is abandoned. Quite a different image from state news channels that have broadcast stories celebrating China's efforts to control the spread and busy building new hospitals. For other journalists, though, it's been more complicated. The LA Times says some foreign reporters have been escorted away from hospitals and forced to delete videos. When one citizen journalist posted images of bodies lying in Wuhan's public hospital, he was reportedly arrested. Then there's this photo posted by another New York Times journalist in Wuhan, patients sitting outside a busy hospital getting IV drips. Other images from local stringers show empty shelves at food markets and lineups for face masks and medical supplies. AFP photojournalist Hector Retanel captured this shot of an elderly man who had collapsed on the pavement near a hospital. Police later confirmed the man had died from the virus. Another AFP journalist wrote, "There were two challenges telling this important story and also making sure that you didn't become part of the story by catching the virus." So what is really going on in Wuhan? That's been the big question reporters and citizen journalists inside the quarantine are trying to answer. Joining me from Wuhan, China, is Chris Buckley. He is the reporter for the New York Times who arrived there on the first day of the lockdown. So, Chris, thanks so much for talking to me. The images that we're seeing, they're terrifying. You're there. Is it as scary as it looks?
People are very frightened, but they are staying in their homes, avoiding going out on the streets as much as possible, except to buy food, except for occasional fresh air, except to go to the hospitals. People will stay at home. So there is fear here, but there's also a sort of as I said, a sort of a strange quiet about the place. And I wouldn't quite call it panic. I think there's a very deep anxiety among people. But for example, you don't see the signs of mass panic that you might imagine in some situations like this.
You have decided to risk your health to stay and file these reports. Why was that so important for you?
Well, it's such a big and important story, and I do feel that being here is fascinating and a privilege. And I do also feel that with the right precautions and a great deal of vigilance, it's possible to be safe here as a journalist. If you're a doctor in the city or a medical worker, I think it's much more dangerous, and they're the people I truly respect here.
We are seeing, obviously the story is getting out now, but even we're hearing that the Chinese officials were allowing more information at some point and now clamping down again. I mean, how difficult is it to get the story out?
Well, some of the most courageous journalists on this story are our Chinese counterparts who work under strict censorship usually, but have really become quite emboldened in dealing with this particular crisis. We've seen a great deal of investigative work by some of China's newspapers and magazines, very admirable work. And some of that work is now coming under pressure. So these newspapers and magazines are still doing serious work, but to judge from the directives that are coming out and to judge from the tone of some of that reporting, there are much more active efforts now to rein in that kind of critical voice that you find in Chinese journalism and also on the Chinese internet at times of crisis like this.
So is that working in the past? The Chinese officials have been very efficient at controlling the news?
It can work, but I think there's also a groundswell of public opinion here that is hungry for information, that is disappointed with at least some ways in which the government has dealt with this epidemic. And there's also another factor that comes into play, certainly in Wuhan, which is although there might be officials and police who are under orders to, for example, to be more vigilant around hospitals, a lot of people just don't want to be around those places. So if you're giving orders to officials or police to carry out these restrictions, you might find some reluctance on their part to simply be around those places.
So what is the story that you want to tell now? What do we need to know?
Well, I think part of the story that we need to know is that there's a great deal of alarm, even hysteria about this virus. And I think it's very important that when readers and audiences hear about numbers, hear about this new coronavirus, they also understand that there are humans behind these stories. And that's very important here in China. I think it's very important everywhere.
Chris Buckley, I appreciate so much your time. I know you've got so much to cover and it's such important work. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Chris Buckley in Wuhan, China.